Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. I'm joined today by Professor David Abulafia to talk about his book, The Boundless Sea. It tells the story of people and trade across all the oceans of the world, starting from the earliest times and going all the way up to the present day. It's a really wonderful read, and it got rave reviews across the press, and it was awarded the Wolfson Prize for History in 2020. So a very warm welcome, Professor, to the podcast.
Thank you.
Before we get on to the book, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, because the name Abulafia is slightly unusual, and it made me wonder a bit about your own, or at least maybe your family's history.
Well, my family has a very long history. We go back to Spain, and my family lived there before 1492. It's a Sephardic family, a Spanish Jewish family, which most of them left Spain in 1492 when the Jews were expelled from Spain. And my own branch of the family, because they were fairly, we know quite a lot about them in Spain, actually. But my own branch of the family went to live in Galilee, in what's now northern Israel. And they stayed there. Many of them are still there, but, not so much there, more in sort of cities like Tel Aviv and so on. But my grandfather, so this takes us way back, because I found a record of him on a ship between London and Gibraltar in 1902. So he left with his father, actually. He became a tea merchant, and he was trading out of London. And he actually became involved in something I discuss in one of the chapters of the book, where I talk about the tea trade through what's now known as Essaouira, Mogador. And there were these merchants based in London and Manchester with this very strong commercial connection to that part of the world. But he was actually born in Tiberias, by the Sea of Galilee. So it's a family with a long and interesting history, very much bound up with the history of the Mediterranean, quite a lot of them living in Italy, where the name is quite common in the form Bolafio, and turning up in particularly Turkey, Greece, that part of the world. The Ottoman Empire, that was really where most of them settled after they left Spain.
When I went on a website, there's some websites which will tell you how common your surname is and where people with your surname are, and it for some reason picked up Argentina, and also
yes. Yeah, well, I think what happened was Ottoman Palestine 120 years ago was going through quite a difficult the Turkish Empire was sort of disintegrating. And there were members of my family, distant relatives, who emigrated to South America looking for a better life. This was something. Also, a lot of people from a bit further north, from Lebanon, enormous numbers went to South America. And they turned up also in Uruguay. And I think there's an Abulafia who owns a football club in Uruguay to this day. So not something my great aspiration, but every continent, actually, apart from Antarctica, every continent pretty well. Australia, quite a few, we're everywhere. Yeah.
Now the history of the world in one surname. Maybe that's your next book. I don't know.
They will. I think they will come into the next book, and indirectly they come into this book, because I talk about that tea trade. And in my previous book, A History of the Mediterranean, they did crop up every now and again, I have to say. I think readers quite like the sort of personal touch to emerge every now and again.
Mm.
In history books being written in America nowadays, they really play up this personal touch. I don't think that goes down so well in Britain or Europe, but readers like to connect a little bit with the author, I think.
Mm. One of the things I learned recently, just before I read your book, in fact, was that there was a strong trade between ancient Rome and India. And I hadn't really appreciated that the Romans had much idea about India. But in fact, there was quite a busy trade between the two parts of the world. And I just wondered, how did that work given the huge distances between the two?
Yes, it's absolutely fascinating. And one of the most interesting aspects is if you actually look at it from the Roman end, you have the great first century sort of geographer, natural historian Pliny complaining about how many sesterces, Roman coins, hundreds and hundreds of thousands being spent each year on the spices of the East. He regarded this as terribly wasteful. And yet there were storehouses, horea as they were called, in Rome and in Ostia, the port of Rome, which were filled to the brim with phenomenal quantities of Indian pepper and other spices. There were some spices. There was one spice called malabathron, which was, I think, more expensive than gold, basically, in terms of, weight by weight. And this taste for pepper, which has stayed with us really ever since, over thousands of years, right through the Middle Ages and so on. It's an interesting feature of sort of human society, the taste for spices. And what's particularly interesting in the Roman setting is that this percolated down. It wasn't just the aristocracy. In the Middle Ages, it would be the nobility, royalty, perhaps some abbots in wealthy monasteries, people like that, who would be consuming pepper and other expensive spices. But in ancient Rome, this is something which was very much, percolating down through the upper middle class, lower middle class, goodness knows, probably even to poorer people in the population. And that is extraordinary. Now, this was achieved because really there was that tremendous base for Roman operations, actually inhabited more by Greeks and Egyptians than by real sort of Romans. So Romans do come up, Italians do come up as well, which was Egypt. Once the Romans had conquered Egypt in the 1st century BC, this provided a base with Alexandria feeding all these spices into the Mediterranean. And then in the other direction, boats would be going down the Nile to a place called Koptos. And Koptos was the point on the Nile. The Nile is a sort of kink in the Nile where it gets closer to the Red Sea. And from there was an overland route which tended to be plagued by bandits and so on, certainly in the Middle Ages, which took you to, there were several ports which had their ups and downs. One which has been excavated is a place called Berenike. But there are others, most extraordinary discoveries going right back to ancient Egyptian times, coils of rope from ancient Egyptian ships, which have been perfectly preserved in the dry atmosphere. The papers of a 13th century AD Muslim merchant, all sorts of things like this, found in the desert at these ports, which gave access down the Red Sea, which in itself wasn't a particularly interesting territory. There wasn't much to acquire. But once you got out towards the bottom of the Red Sea, the lands which were rich in myrrh and frankincense, and then through the straits beyond Yemen, then you could cut across to India, because Greek merchants trading along this route before the Roman takeover of Egypt had discovered how to cut across the Western Indian Ocean by taking advantage of the monsoon winds. If you actually knew how the winds operated, you didn't have to edge around Arabia and then what's now Pakistan and so on, cut right across. So quite a lot of them went to northern India, taking a sort of a slight advantage of these winds, but others learned how to take much greater advantage of the winds and headed for southern India. So we end up, the most extraordinary discoveries which were made, for instance, in Pondicherry. Pondicherry is famous as the French enclave in British India. It was only given up, I think, when the British evacuated India in 1947. But that's on the other side. That's beyond Sri Lanka. on the Bay of Bengal in southern India. And that was a major base for trading operations. And these so-called Romans, I mean, as I say, most of them were Greeks. We have a sort of memoir written by one of these Greek merchants, which describes the route in great detail. And they were Greeks living in Egypt, but trading all the way back and forth between Egypt and India. And this is, again, something which crops up again in the Middle Ages when we have amazing documentation about merchants, mainly Jewish merchants based in Cairo, who followed the same sort of route and went and lived in South India, set up bronze workshops, things like this, but also exported spices up the Red Sea and then right across the Mediterranean. You know, some of them would end up in places like Bruges or even London, ultimately, I mean, having been passed from hand to hand.
One of the things I have become aware of was that at various times they had a canal between the Red Sea and the Nile. And I'm sort of trying to work out how that would work, because did they have locks in these days? Would there not have been a sort of a fall in the level between the river and the sea? And what was be to stop, the river sort of rushing through?
Well, that's a very good question, and I've asked myself the same question. I think I've even sometimes said aloud, how was this possible? Because this was one of the great challenges when the Suez Canal was built, the differences in level between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And these connections, which were built first by the ancient Egyptians, the Persians had a go. There was something every now and again. They would sort of find the traces of the ancient canal and sort of dig those up. They were connections which actually led into the Nile Delta. I don't know if that is perhaps significant when it came to the level of the sea, but it is mysterious. It is really very mysterious. And at times we're told that these canals were wide enough for two ships to pass one another, but these can't have been very large ships. Whereas the Red Sea traffic actually was dominated by reasonably large ships. There were some actually which were adapted which could carry wild animals taken from East Africa, elephants even, which were pretty large. So they couldn't possibly have gone down these relatively narrow canals. But it's an interesting puzzle which somebody needs to sort out. I agree.
There was an interesting story about the Roman trade with India. I can't remember if it was in your book or the other book, which I think you reference in your book, which was that Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, apparently when Antony and Cleopatra, met their grisly end, he fled to the Red Sea and was planning to take a boat.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's, it was, one has to remember that the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean were very much on the, they were part of the sort of mental equipment of these Greco-Romans living in Egypt. It was a world they were very familiar with, although they hadn't actually conquered it. And of course, you have to go back a bit further in time and remember that Alexander the Great had managed to conquer Persia. He'd established cities, usually called Alexandria, along the Persian Gulf. So, there was actually quite a lot of interaction there. And the Persian Gulf, there was this very large center of trade called Gerha, which had close interaction with these Romans and Greeks. The island of Socotra, which is sort of out there in the Indian Ocean, it's now ruled from Yemen, but quite a distance from Yemen, was a sort of center of exchange where all these merchants would gather. They found Polish archaeologists working there in the 1950s, 60s, found an enormous cave inscribed with inscriptions written by these merchants from every possible background, Greeks and Buddhists and everything really. It was obviously a cult center of some sort, but all gathering on this relatively barren island, which was like a sort of interchange on this sort of network of routes.
Oh, poor old Caesarion, he made the mistake of turning back and throwing himself on the mercy of Octavian, which didn't turn out to be forthcoming.
Yeah, I mean, Octavian was he was capable of acting very decisively, you might say. Yes, when it came to dealing with his enemies, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, no, he had a clear understanding of what needed to be done, and then he did it. So sort of moving up. So we've sort of been in the Red Sea, which is nice and warm and toasty. But moving up to somewhere a bit colder, your book seems to be, I think, inevitably, of course, it's mainly about men, but it does have this great exception in the case of the Vikings, or the Norse at least. And in particular, you tell some stories about two very strong Norse women who spent some time living in America. And so, how do the Norse end up in America?
Yes, they're not in America for very long, but it's absolutely true that there are, in the sagas, we have two sagas written sometime after, a couple of centuries after the Norse were actually present in that part of America. I'll explain why I said that part in a minute. And there's no reason to disbelieve that these people existed, or that one of them actually gave birth in America. So that would mean that there was a Norse kid who was the first European to be born, as far as we know, in America. The presence of these, I don't tend to call them Vikings, because the word Viking conjures up the image of aggressive warriors who are, rather sort of steamed up with all the various sort of drugs they inhaled and so on, and going around berserk, destroying monasteries. These people were looking for lands to settle, and this had begun the end of the 10th century when Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland and sailed off to Greenland, which was vaguely known about, and established a settlement in the southwest of Greenland, which is strangely called the Eastern Settlements, actually on the western side, which was actually more fertile territory than Iceland. One has to remember that. People always laugh at this name Greenland, and there's this idea that the name was conjured up to suggest that it was much more fertile than it was, but it actually was more fertile than Iceland. There wasn't much you could do there. You couldn't really grow crops, but you could pasture sheep there, which is what they did very successfully. And they learned how to trade at some stage with the Inuit and other Eskimo, to use an old-fashioned word, peoples. They became very interested in the trade in walrus ivory. So you had Northern Europe being supplied with ivory from Greenland, and even Greenland falcons, which end up at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, Frederick II, in the 13th century. So living there, it's not surprising that some ships, as had happened in the case of Greenland, blown off course, end up discovering that there is land still further to the west. What they thought this was is a moot point. But first of all, icy land, then rocky land. And then as they explored a bit further south, they discovered, again, more fertile land, which was given the name Vinland, which there's some debate about what it really means, but it seems to mean the land of wine. So what sort of wine? Were they really grapes, or were they large sort of blueberries or gooseberries or whatever they were? And that's where the sagas become a little bit incredible, with this German slave becoming drunk. He's in their party, becomes drunk on eating lots of grapes. Well, eating lots of grapes isn't going to make you drunk, but it's a good story. And the problem that they had in America, where archaeologists have discovered one of their settlements on Newfoundland, was that the local inhabitants, the Micmac Indians, turned quite hostile. I mean, it may be that the Norsemen actually initiated the hostilities, but they discovered that it was really impossible to live there. Right. So they were talking about the years around 1000. Very briefly there, this settlement in Newfoundland was obviously abandoned quite quickly. It may have encouraged them to move even further south. There have even been claims that they got right down to the Gulf of Mexico. I don't believe that. But anyway, but what did happen, and people tend to forget this, was that living in Greenland, which didn't have much in the way of forest, nothing really. If they needed to get hold of wood, which they did, because being Norsemen, they moved around by ship, even just, little boats to get from one settlement to another. They had to find their wood somewhere. So they were constantly crossing over to what they called Markland, which was north of Greenland, which was a wooded area between the icy and the fertile, and we know this, the archaeological evidence shows that, for instance, larch wood from North America was being used in the settlements in Greenland. And so every now and again, some of these, if you like, North American products were filtering through to Iceland as far as Germany even. There is a reference to something which sounds as if it might be a carved wooden object brought from American Indians or Inuit or something like that. So what strikes me, what is more remarkable in a way, is that the Norse remained in Greenland for at least 400 years. It may be that the Norse colony in Greenland only disappeared at the end of the 15th century. I think probably a bit earlier than that. But that is, it's an extraordinary expanse of time. And it was only towards the end that contact got broken off with Iceland, though probably English pirates and others helped to fill the gap, but because they were certainly receiving European clothes, for instance, in the 15th century.
And what possesses people to stay in such an inhospitable part of the world, do you think?
It's a fascinating question, which of course goes back really to the early history of human migration. Why people, just think about the settlement of the Americas by, in what we might call the Ice Age, people moving across from Siberia and having to move around these massive glaciers down probably quite a narrow corridor of land in order to get into more accessible, comfortable parts of the Americas. I suppose, a number of basic attractions that the Greenland, for instance, as I say, they could pasture their sheep. They had quite a rich diet, actually, contrary to what people used to argue, that they were all sort of living on the sort of edge of subsistence. That's clearly not the case. Plenty of fish, all that sort of thing. The search for fish actually was big business in the Northern Atlantic in the late Middle Ages. So you can see that there were certain sort of, commercially it wasn't a bad thing. They probably could do quite well out of the sale of the walrus ivory. That was a really valuable product. So it's that sort of search for being prepared to meet these environmental challenges in the search for profit and a peaceful existence, which they had really compared to the situation in Iceland or Norway.
Obviously, while, and I suppose America is a good example of this, but obviously while exploration is underway, nobody really knows what's out there, and so they create their own ideas. And one of the themes of your book is the constant misconceptions about the shape of the world. And so, for example, when Columbus sets out, he thinks India maybe isn't too far away. But one thing I don't understand about that is that didn't people have quite a good idea of the size of the world? Going back to the times of the ancient Greeks, they pretty much worked out what the circumference of the world was. So how does Columbus come to the view that India is just over the horizon?
Well, he's relying on different calculations, basically. This Florentine geographer, Toscanelli, whose views were not universally accepted. We have to remember that Columbus was when his ideas were examined at the Spanish court, it was sort of concluded that he got it all wrong. So, there was this argument that, particularly that the Eurasian landmass was larger, that the globe was smaller, and of course, without any knowledge of the two enormous continents in the middle, North and South America, an assumption that the Atlantic Ocean did indeed reach across to Japan and China. And if you actually look at the maps being produced, there's this amazing globe. It's the first proper globe, actually, to have survived, by Martin Behaim, who was a South German cartographer, and himself actually went on Atlantic voyages. And there he's got Japan, Chipangu, described by Marco Polo. Nobody knew anything really apart from what Marco Polo had said about Japan. But he's placed it really sort of 2/3 of the way across this intermediate ocean between Europe and China. So the assumption that Japan was much closer and China then a little bit sort of short leap beyond that was something which Columbus could sort of latch on to. And Columbus was a bit of a fanatic, and like a lot of fanatics, he found the idea that appealed to him. This was the solution. He was going to go with that.
And when there's quite a lot in your book about China, of course, because it's one of the most advanced civilizations on the globe for a very long time, and it's a producer of a lot of very sophisticated goods. But one of the things I found quite interesting was this idea that when people brought goods to China, the authorities there wanted to view that as tribute. And I was trying to understand, was that just another word for trade, but with something else built on top, or was it genuinely something different?
That's a very good question. I suppose one answer would be to say, well, to an economist, I'm not an economist, I'm something of an economic historian, tribute could be seen as a variant form of trade, but it's a form of trade which is built around certain political presuppositions that gifts are due to those who are in a position of power out of respect, but that these gifts, in return for these gifts, you give smaller gifts back to the petitioner. So it's a sort of institutionalized form of trade through the court, very centralized. It's through the royal court or princely court or whatever. The reality, of course, is more complex than that, because what one's really looking at is these extraordinary embassies. I mean, you take the example of embassies between Korea and China in the early Middle Ages, or Japan and China, where the ambassadors are spending years and years just waiting to be received by the emperor with a petition to be allowed to establish some sort of commercial political relationship, obviously having to recognize the superiority of the Chinese emperor over all other kings. Now, in the course of all these negotiations, what actually also happens on the side is quite a lot of trade, because these embassies consisted of hundreds of people. Quite different to a modern, you think about our people going off to Brussels to negotiate with Monsieur Barnier. There were, about 4 of them, I think, most of the time. No, we're talking about 400, something like that. Whole shiploads, and with their servants and slaves and everything. And they were actually allowed to take goods and to do a bit of trading on the side. And if they were there for years, they probably developed quite a little sort of business on the side, you would imagine. So there's that side of it. And what also happened in the case of China was there's an oscillation between insistence on this tributary relationship. And then, on the other hand, there were periods in which China, to use a modern word, sort of liberalized and opened up to maritime commerce in particular. So in the Song dynasty, So we're talking about 11th, 12th centuries, early 13th century period, when partly because the dynasty itself its political base was in southern China, didn't have access to whatever was coming along the so-called Silk Roads, which wasn't very much at that period anyway. So they were locking into the sea routes, which took silk and porcelain and so on out through the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean, all the way towards India and the Islamic world. So there you begin to see quite active trade in the sort of a more recognizable way, and the development of diasporas, settlements of Chinese in places like Java and ultimately in Malacca in the 15th century, this new trading city in what's now Malaysia on the Straits of Malacca, which was in a key position and, as far as we can tell, had this enormous Chinese colony pretty well from the start of its history. So so tribute, that's the official nature of the exchange at various points. But underneath it, I think there's a much richer history of doing business and the quantity of goods being exported by the Chinese is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, they were buying much larger quantities of spices from the so-called East Indies, so Indonesia and Malaysia, than the Arabs and the Europeans were. They were exporting millions and millions of pieces of porcelain, various qualities. I mean, it's not all absolutely top quality, but enormous quantities. Some of the shipwrecks that have been discovered off Indonesia, you have 500,000 or more pieces of porcelain aboard these ships, which are being taken out into the Indian Ocean. And underneath one of the suburbs of Cairo, which was inhabited by Coptic and Jewish merchants in the Middle Ages, they've already found 700,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain. And some of it got as far west as Morocco. What's curious is not much of it got into Europe. A little bit did, but in the Middle Ages. And then the silk as well, of course, which doesn't survive in the shipwrecks, but that must have been a very major part of the cargo. So these maritime routes linking China to the Islamic world and ultimately the Mediterranean, they carried far, far greater quantities of goods, Chinese goods, than did the so-called Silk Road, which was an intermittent, this road across Eurasia, very famous, very important in the history of the spread of Buddhism, for instance. But in terms of the quantity of goods, it couldn't compete with these very large Chinese junks and then other ships in the Indian Ocean carrying phenomenal quantities of goods, century after century.
And the Chinese famously send out voyages and under the leader of a gentleman whose name now escapes me, but he goes out and he visits Africa. I think there are 3 voyages, maybe 4, I can't remember. And then they decide they don't need to do that. But presumably trade doesn't stop when the voyages of discovery stop. But in Japan, it seems like trade does dry up very largely, albeit it's funneled through Dejima as far as Western trade is concerned. Now, I sort of feel like in sort of putting that together, I'm covering such a wide range, but perhaps you can respond to that.
Well, it's a long period of time, but you're right. The famous, the Admiral, Zheng He, as he's now pronounced, used to be Cheng Ho, but we now transcribe Chinese differently. Zheng He, around 1400, this series of voyages, I mean, they are extraordinary because they took his ships as far as the coast of East Africa, bringing back giraffes and all sorts of other exotic animals. Some of the ships went up into the Red Sea, and some of his sailors visited Mecca. And then you have contacts, obviously, with Sri Lanka, all sorts of other places en route. As I've said, Malacca, that was actually one of the key stopping points along these voyages, visits to Java. These voyages are a great mystery because exactly what the motive was for building these enormous fleets, even though in my book I do say that the fleets, you shouldn't believe the figures that are given for the number of people traveling, the size of the ships, probably rather smaller than we've usually been led to believe. It all depends on what a Chinese foot actually was, but and in order to be seaworthy, they can't have been as large as they're often said to be. But
if you can fit a giraffe on board, they can't be so small.
Yeah, I think I say at some point that returning from East Africa, it was like a sort of Noah's Ark with all these animals on board. And what the motive behind this was is a really fascinating question. I think basically it comes back to this tribute and trade idea. It wasn't a question of setting up a Chinese trading network or trying to establish direct Chinese rule, or, as some have argued, to find the tooth of the Buddha in Ceylon, or to there's another theory that it was all to do with tracing a rival for the throne who'd escaped somewhere they never knew where, and the Chinese emperor, the Yongle emperor as he's called, was desperate to find him. That's no good. The explanation really is that the Chinese empire wanted, as it were, to show itself to the world, and while recognizing that it could not directly rule over all these territories, to receive the submission of all these territories. And that was something which was deeply bound up with the sort of ideology of the Chinese empire in this period. So having collected all this information, and no doubt they were absolutely fascinated by, the giraffes and everything else, they didn't actually really act on it in a very significant way. And, perhaps this is something which was in some ways characteristic of Chinese science. There was a very famous historian of Chinese science whom I knew quite well at the beginning of my career, Joseph Needham, who wrote a multi-volume history of science and civilization in China, for whom the central question was, the Chinese discovered all these things, but why is it then that they came to lag behind? Take the question of the compass. Now, the compass was clearly developed independently by the Norse, by the merchants of Amalfi in the Mediterranean, and so on. It wasn't just a Chinese invention. But they knew about compasses in the centuries BC. However, they didn't begin to use the compass for maritime purposes until the 11th, 12th centuries AD, when they actually were sending ships, the Song dynasty sending ships out across the South China Sea. But what they did do, they used the compass for the purposes of feng shui, for working out in how to situate the rooms in a house or whatever it might be. So the idea of using these inventions for technological improvement was something which perhaps they didn't always seem to grasp hold of. Now, when it comes to the question of Japan, one thing which I do try to do in the book is to show that Japan wasn't quite as isolated as is often made out. For instance, in the late 16th century, 17th century, enormous numbers of Japanese merchants and mercenaries turn up in the Philippines, which were then under Spanish rule, and which were the link between China on the one hand and Mexico on the other, serviced by this galleon trade, the so-called Manila galleon. Well, Chinese ships coming to Manila in the Philippines, and then the Spanish ships going from the Philippines to Mexico. But there was a very important Japanese connection. The Japanese actually allied with the Spaniards very often, and helping to suppress the Chinese rebellion, all that sort of thing. And the increasing isolation of Japan is very much bound up with the if you like, changing mood of the shoguns, the effective rulers, given that the emperor was more of a figurehead, the shoguns in Japan, who were particularly suspicious. It wasn't simply to do with commercial penetration. It was to do with the missionaries, the Portuguese missionaries who were establishing themselves very successfully in southern Japan, and whose conversion of the population was being supported by some of the daimyos, that's to say the local nobility. And that was, again, from the point of view of the Japanese government, it was very much a question of guaranteeing the loyalty of their subjects. And I think they saw the daimyos as people who were, that this was, they saw this as a sort of an independence movement, if you like, on the southern edges of Japan, which threatened to penetrate deep into the main island. So they began to close down. They expelled the Portuguese. They crucified not just the missionaries, but a great many Japanese Christians. It's a horrific story, actually, in the 17th century. And then they opened up in due course just to this one group. And it is, as you say, it's an extraordinary thing, this colony at Deshima, which was an artificial island off Nagasaki. Quite a small area, really very small area, where only the Dutch were allowed to trade. And that remained the case into the 19th century. So every now and again, others would turn up off their shores. Russian ships or something like that would turn up at their shores and be politely sort of shooed away. But it took a very long time for them to be willing to open up fully. On the other hand, they did import, and this is an example of technological sort of appropriation, which very much succeeded. The Dutch brought in guns. They had the technology to reproduce these guns. So that was extremely useful from the point of view of the political authorities in Japan, which wanted, obviously, to arm themselves better. But also things like scientific knowledge, medical knowledge, all that sort of thing was being channeled through Deshima and books being translated and so on, but all under the tightest possible control. So the only Dutch person who was allowed to visit the court of the shogun was the so-called captain of Holland, as they called him. And he had to make a sort of journey of submission every year or so to just to sort of confirm the nature of this relationship. And they weren't allowed to practice Christianity either. There were very strict rules against any display of Christianity. Even putting up the date on a building was considered to be a dangerous expression of Christianity. Sorry, yeah.
I've actually visited Dejima, and a very fascinating place it is. And it is startling just how tiny the area is. And they must have had quite a miserable existence living there.
Yeah, and for the Dutch, who were many of them sort of keen Calvinist Christians, to be told that they weren't even supposed to bring in Bibles and so on, it must have been a difficult existence, I'm sure. Yeah.
And did the Japanese at this stage, did they still trade with China, or was the policy to be completely closed to the outside world, including China?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think about that, and also in relation to Korea, which was their closest neighbor and an enormous cultural influence on them in earlier centuries. I mean, they had, in the late Middle Ages, they'd fought a sort of a battle of words with the Chinese emperors, trying to shake off the Chinese claims to dominion. And then eventually, in the 15th century, they sort of accepted that they were subordinate, but nonetheless still imperial, if you like, still the masters of their own empire. And the Chinese had gone along with that. By this period, I think we really are looking at much more restricted contact. As I've said, though, there was in the 17th century, late 16th, 17th century, contact with China through the Philippines. So lots of Japanese going there to to sell. They sold grain, actually. They realized that the Spaniards wanted to eat bread, and the Japanese, who one doesn't think of them as great bread eaters, but they were growing wheat and selling it in the Philippines. But in the Philippines, they could buy lots of Chinese goods, of course.
You mentioned the Portuguese in Japan, and one of the things that sort of startled me a bit in your book, because I've sort of got a very Anglo-centric view of the world, is the extent to which the world is, for a long period, divided up between the Spanish and the Portuguese. And can you say a bit about how they came to sort of divide the world in two?
Yes, I mean, the Portuguese, who in the start of the 15th century, they inhabited one of the poorest, most marginal, if you like, kingdoms in Europe. It is an extraordinary story of transformation during that century into a great maritime power, and something which their neighbours, the Castilians, a much larger, much more powerful kingdom, which was coming to dominate the Iberian Peninsula. They'd come to sort of dominate their neighbours in Aragon, eventually the little kingdom of Navarre. They were about to conquer the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, Granada. And so Portugal was a sort of an irritant, culturally different, of course, speaking a different language. And what built up was a very intense rivalry, particularly the figure who's most associated with early Portuguese expansion, Prince Henry the Navigator, so the king's son, who was partly responsible for the settlement of Madeira, the Azores, for attempts to conquer the Canaries, for the first slaving expeditions down the coast of West Africa, and so on. He had a sort of visceral hatred of the Castilians. It was a deep rivalry. It turned on issues to do with where the frontier lay. It turned on past alliances with the English and the French, one Portuguese being much closer to the English over a great many centuries. So there were all these issues between the two kingdoms. And I think the trouble really began to blow up over these claims to the Canary Islands, which had been discovered in the 14th century, and the Portuguese already had a stake there in the 14th century, but were gradually absorbed by the Spaniards, and which had an existing population, Berber population, which lived a sort of Stone Age existence. And it's a fascinating subject in its own right. So there were these rivalries building up, and then as the Spaniards began to build up their interest in Seville and Cadiz and so on, once they'd conquered Gibraltar, controlled the Strait of Gibraltar, their own Atlantic interests were becoming more and more significant. But what put a cap on all of this was naturally the discovery of the Caribbean by Columbus, and the awareness that while the Portuguese were getting ahead with their exploration of the coast of Africa, which by that stage had reached right down to the southern tip of Africa, there was another way possibly to reach the spices of the East. And that's when, in order to resolve the difference, the papacy came in. And as a result, there's a whole series of agreements and so on, but the most important of them in 1494, this division of the world, a certain distance west of the Cape Verde Islands, which had been settled by the Portuguese around 1460, so those islands off the coast of West Africa, with the Western Hemisphere being assigned to the Castilians, the Spaniards, and the Eastern Hemisphere to the Portuguese. And interestingly, no real thought about what happened on the other side of the world, because and this is very important actually, because when the Philippines were visited by Magellan in the early 16th century, and then by later Spanish expeditions, and eventually actually brought under the rule of the Viceroy of Mexico, would you believe it? counted as part of Mexico, there was this big argument about, well, were the Philippines actually on the Portuguese side or on the Spanish side? Anyway, the Spaniards won that argument for a great many centuries. But each side obviously constantly trying to break the rules. So, trade in West Africa, the slave trade, the Spaniards trying to interfere in that, but the Portuguese remaining dominant, and interference in the spice trade, all this sort of thing was quite normal. And eventually it sort of settled down into a sort of cooperation. So if you want to understand, coming back to the slave trade, the very large numbers of slaves, black slaves, being imported into the Caribbean because of the extinction as a result of the conquest of the native population, Native American Indian population. The Portuguese were supplying the slaves to Spanish colonial powers. So it did work out over the centuries as a cooperative relationship, but it took a long time to do that.
I can't remember who it was that said it, maybe Dr. Johnson. He said something to the effect that there's no settling precedence between a louse and a flea. But I did get the impression from your book that the Portuguese were unspeakably violent in their dealings with other peoples. And were they typical of the time, or was there something unusual about the Portuguese?
I think, those are the accounts which are perfectly reliable of how at the start of the 16th century, with Vasco da Gama and then his successors, notably a gentleman called Albuquerque, who eventually conquered Malacca in 1511, the accounts of the extreme violence and the coercion of the rulers of the Indian cities and also actually the East African cities, who, their cities were bombarded by the Portuguese fleet. Their ships were sunk with innocent passengers on board, drowning in sight of everybody and so on. This unspeakable cruelty was something which, yes, it was very much a sort of badge of Portuguese expansion, but you find similar sorts of things with the Dutch, certainly, and with the other colonial powers. The one that emerges a little bit better, possibly, that comes a bit later, this is more in the 17th century, the Danes, who were actually quite a significant maritime power, but not on the scale of the Portuguese, Dutch, or Spaniards. Then when it comes to the Spaniards, one does think also about the extraordinary cruelty, for instance, during the conquest of Cuba from 1502 onwards. So, 1512, onwards. It does seem to be very much typical of this period, I regret to say. And also, of course, the abominable cruelty towards the slaves who were being exported en masse across the Atlantic.
And once they divided the world in two, so the Spanish pretty much had America apart from Brazil, which I guess the line had been moved to allow Brazil to fall within the Portuguese hemisphere. So now the Spanish have Mexico. And so they're able to open up a route. I'm not sure I've completely understood this, but is it right that they've opened up a route across Mexico so you can now export or take goods from Manila across Mexico into the Atlantic? Is that the way it works with
That's the way it works, yeah. So to begin at the other end of the chain, the process begins somewhere in the interior of China, Chengdu or somewhere like that, with porcelain, Guangzhou producing silk or whatever, coming down to Macau, the Portuguese colony just opposite modern Hong Kong, and then being taken across to Manila by the Portuguese, or alternatively Chinese ships coming into Manila from Chinese ports. So you've got that. And then from 1565 to 1815, almost without an interruption, once or twice interruptions by English pirates or whatever, but the Manila galleon, sometimes just one very large ship, sometimes more than one, taking this route, which was a great arc, which almost reached Japan, actually. They thought for a time of trying to incorporate Japan into the route, and went across this great arc, across the Pacific, to reach Acapulco. And so there you were in Mexico. And then goods had to be humped across. That's quite true. They had to be humped across Mexico. And then once they reached the Caribbean, they were forwarded to Havana. And Havana became one of the great centers. This is, long before the Cuban sugar industry developed or anything like that. Now, a lot of these goods, the silk and porcelain, so a lot of it was consumed actually within Mexico or the other Spanish colonies in the Americas, because Mexico is much larger then than it is now. It included California and so on. But a significant proportion then went all the way on to Cadiz and Seville and was fed into Europe. So it is an extraordinary story of global connections. And, this word globalization tends to be thrown around, and it means different things to different people. I do use it once or twice in my book, but this is a sort of, if you like, proto-globalization that one's looking at, with Chinese goods coming by that route to Europe, but also the other route. There's also the Portuguese route around India, around the bottom of Africa. So the whole world is sort of bound together by these trade routes, with China very much in the middle, really.
One of my few complaints about your book is I'm always trying to work out how big things are. So you might say, for example, that a Roman ship can carry 300 tons. And I'm trying to think, what does that look like? And I'm trying to think, how many bags of sugar would that be? When we come to measuring the size of Israel, we always say, well, it's about the size of Wales. And I think, okay, I know how big Wales is. Yeah. I have no idea in my head how big 300 tons is.
It's very difficult. Of course, it depends in any case on what the article being carried is and so on. So when we're talking about silk, we're looking at something which is obviously relatively light and has to be packed very carefully and so on in waterproof containers. So that sort of thing take up a lot of space. So you might need quite a big ship to carry an enormous amount of silk. And then other things, grain, porcelain obviously is very heavy. So it's a real puzzle. And as I said earlier, there are big questions here. These Chinese junks, whether they really were as large as we're told. We know that they had 13 compartments usually. So people who built them did what the builders of the Titanic thought they were doing, and they sectioned off different parts. Not that it necessarily made them unsinkable any more than the Titanic, but getting a real sense of that is a big challenge. And actually, sometimes it was the smaller ships anyway that proved much more useful. If you take the Portuguese, these caravels, these small sailing ships, which were sort of developed really out of their fishing fleet, they had the great virtue of being small enough to go up the West African rivers. So the Portuguese were able to make contact with African kings and establish trading relations into the interior, which is what they very much wanted because they were trying to get to the sources of gold. But this is a real puzzle. I suppose, in a way, it culminates in the situation. Looking at the very last photographs in my book, last color pictures, where we've got a container ship that carries 13,000 containers, and it's just very difficult to imagine that you can get 13,000 containers into that, but apparently it's true. Or indeed the passenger ship on the same page, which is supposed to carry about 9,000 passengers plus crew. There are sort of mental gymnastics which it's very difficult to perform. I hope the pictures might help a little bit with that. I hope.
And the other thing that struck me, and I think you do advert to it occasionally, is, and this struck me in particular regarding the Romans, because they weren't known for their shipbuilding skills really. I'm not saying that they were, bits of wood tied together with string, but they weren't particularly well-built ships. And I'm thinking, how did they stop stuff from getting wet? Because the waves rock you from side to side, and the water must gush in. And you can bail all you like, but if you're carrying silk or grain or peppers, doesn't everything just get spoiled?
I mean, you need to keep sort of recorking the ships. You need to have lots of slaves to bail out, of course, as well. That's extremely important. Packaging, it's interesting. I mean, no doubt somewhere someone's writing a very learned PhD thesis on packaging of goods in ancient and medieval ships. But it's actually an interesting question, the extent to which they could, were they able to make sort of oilskins which would somehow keep out the water? No, the question of how you actually keep certain products dry is very interesting because if you think of grain, which was one of the main products being traded by sea in the past, I mean, the Dutch in the Baltic, phenomenal quantities of rye. I was looking at a picture of a ship being loaded with grain in Chicago, which was actually for a time, believe it or not, the largest port in the United States in the late 19th century.
No, hang on. I don't understand. Chicago. I've been to Chicago. It's a long way inland.
It's a long way inland, but it's on Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan feeds into the Lake Erie and whatnot, and then into the St. Lawrence. So you could actually send not very large ships, because the St. Lawrence hadn't been enlarged till the mid-20th century or something. But you could send ships all the way to the Port of London from Chicago. Now, one of the products which was carried on these ships, more I think for internal consumption in the USA and Canada, was grain. And what struck me extraordinary picture of them loading grain from a silo down a sort of tube into the ship, and they didn't even package the grain. They just filled up the hold with grain. And this, of course, does raise the question how well sealed the bottom of the ship might have been. Now, I can't tell from the photo whether it's a wooden ship. I think it is, actually. I mean, with a metal hull, you might have some hope that it can all stay dry. But it's a very interesting question. Maybe they were prepared to tolerate a certain amount of spoilage on a relatively short voyage. I don't know. But in the Middle Ages, everything would be placed in sacks, but the sacks would not, I expect, be waterproofed. So there are issues there.
Yeah, maybe they had some sort of shelving or double hull or something of that sort. I don't know.
Yeah, when it came to porcelain, they were very careful the way they packed things. So larger pieces, obviously, with smaller pieces packed inside them, and then some sort of material to protect them, one piece from the other, stop them rubbing against each other and so on. So there were real efforts made to protect these items.
Towards the end of your book, at the end of your book, it all seemed a little bit melancholy because it now seems like the world is a shrunken place, with these huge ships and their containers. And I visited, I sort of took a little boat trip around the docks in Tokyo, and we went past a container port, and it was enormously impressive. But it seems, I don't want to use the word romance because I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the excitement and the interest and the individuals, all that's gone. It just seems to be machines now.
That's very much what I'm trying to convey at the end of the book, that the port cities of past times, where people of all sorts of ethnic backgrounds, social station, etc., mixed together to make the ports work, where goods were brought together, unloaded from land transport or river transport or whatever, packed up again, put in the boats by these longshoremen and whatever else, these dockers. That's a world that's totally vanished. And allowing for all the sort of documentation that has to be produced, you could load goods, I don't know, in Pittsburgh into, which is nowhere near the sea, into a container and deliver them in Warsaw, which again is nowhere near the sea. They'll have passed through ports, but they won't actually have, as it were, had a port experience. It'll simply have been a question of moving the goods off a train or whatever into the hold of one of these enormous container ships. Off they go, etc. It's become a purely sort of mechanical exercise, which is extremely efficient. I mean, when it costs, 1 cent per can of beer to send it all the way, let's say, from China, not that China's such an enormous beer exporter, all the way from China to Europe, 10 cents per television set. That's, again, it's a minute sum of money.
It's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
Transport's effectively become free in a sense.
Yeah. And, that's, when we talk about globalization, that's, of course, one of the key phenomena. Yeah.
How does that, to slightly change the subject, how does that play into your views on the Brexit debate? Because I think I read in your biography that you're one of the historians for Brexit. And I wondered if your sort of insights on trade and history of trade were affecting your thinking there.
Well, to some extent. I think I have to say that for me, it was more of a sort of political question. And obviously for all of us, it's something that, we all agonized about and so on. But to me, I think it is clear that the British Isles have tended to look in those two directions, at least since John Cabot went to America in 1497. We've looked towards Europe, but we've also looked outwards to the Atlantic, and then as a result of our imperial adventures into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific as well. So it's that sort of tension between what you might call a global role and a European role, which I think is it's a distinguishing feature, if you like, compared to some of our neighbours. France has something of the same, obviously, because though its imperial adventures were much more within close proximity, in North Africa, West Africa, and so on. So I think that is an important feature of our relationship, not just with Europe, but with the rest of the world. And if we go far back in time, you can already see signs of that with, as I said, the English sort of ranging as far as Iceland in search of fish, Norway, etc., looking out in that direction as well as towards the continent. But the connection to the continent's also been, of course, fundamentally important. The Flemish, the wool trade towards Flanders, the cloth trade, and so on.
But then, so from what I understand from what you say, then your argument would be more a question of issues of sovereignty and government rather than
and to some extent also the question of common history, the extent to which we do, our history in many ways, well, particularly our legal system actually has diverged from the more, so if you like, Napoleonic legal system that one sees within Europe. So there's a different sort of political culture that's developed here, which we share with, Canada and Australia, but to a greater degree in many ways than we do with France or Italy.
I was on the fence when it came to Brexit, and I don't know, it doesn't seem to be going terribly well at the moment, but maybe in 10 years' time it'll all look very different. I hope so.
Well, I think part of the problem is, of course, what's going to happen to the European Union, irrespective of whether we're in or out. Clearly, it was undergoing enormous strains. The euro crisis, that's still not resolved. I'm always amazed how resilient the euro is as a currency. And then the aftermath, assuming there is an aftermath and this horror doesn't continue for decades, of the pandemic, which is just, ravaging the economy of all the European countries, including ourselves. So it's very important to think of ourselves as, European but not in the European Union. I think that's something which I would insist on. One can be perfectly well part of Europe and at the same time not part of the European Union. I'm actually reminded of this looking at what's been happening in America, where you're observing a political system. I referred to the analogies between our parliamentary system and that in a country like Canada, but the United States, it's a very different political system. It's a very different political culture. The whole way in which the division of powers operates and so on, or doesn't operate at the moment. We're in that sense, we are closer to our European neighbours, it seems to me. But there still is a degree of divergence that somehow needed to be accommodated. It turned out it couldn't be accommodated within the EU.
Anyway, I seem to have driven us off the side of the road and into a ditch, so I apologise for that. But it's an interesting subject.
Oh, very. Yeah. And as a historian, I'm more concerned with the past than the future. But one does occasionally get sucked into some of these political questions.
Well, anyway, I think astonishingly, in an hour and a quarter, we've kind of moved our way through some of the bits of your book, but I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is completely changed my perspective on the world, and maybe that's parochial little Englander, I don't know, but I found bits of it absolutely head spinning. So thank you so much for the book.
Well, it's supposed to change your perspective of the world. I'm very glad you say that, because, of course, what it starts by saying is let's try and look at the world from a totally different perspective. That is to say, the 70% of the globe that's covered in water and how human beings have operated in that space. And then, how does that relate to what's been happening on the land masses? So sort of inverting usually the sort of maritime things are just a sort of an add-on, but actually trying to write a global history from the perspective of the sea itself.
So what's next? Because you've done all the seas.
Well, I haven't done all of them. There are some little ones tucked away here and there that I think deserve a bit of attention. So but at the moment with the pandemic, it's not that easy to get hold of the books and articles and so on, and not possible to travel, which is, of course, very frustrating, because for this sort of work, it's really vital to visit some of them. We can't visit all the places. But, I was supposed, I think, around now to be flying off to Mumbai to give a lecture, which I would have loved to have done, which would have been about the history of the Indian Ocean. So I do feel a little bit out of sorts with, being stuck at home. But there we are.
I did enjoy I'll cut this bit out, but I did enjoy your bits about Japan, particularly because I'm a keen visitor to Japan, and I've been to Dejima, and I found that I felt a lot of the time I would have benefited, if I'd been to Macau, if I'd been to Malacca, if I'd been to these places and could have seen them inside my eye, because when you talked about Dejima, I thought, oh yeah, I've seen that. I know exactly what you're talking about. And sometimes, there's nothing like being able to go there and see it.
Yeah, I've been twice to Japan, and I hope it might be possible to go again before too long. I really love being there, and you can see the amount of attention I give to Japan. It's a little bit out of proportion, but it's such a fascinating subject, and the whole question of it. It's often difficult relationship with the sea. I particularly enjoyed writing about that monk Enin who goes across to China, and the terrible experiences he and others have crossing the water between Japan and China. But another thing, having been twice to Japan, I made my first proper visit to China. I'd been to Guangzhou, but only for a day from Hong Kong, but made my first proper visit to China in March 2019. And actually that helped me very much also to understand Japan, the roots of so many features of Japanese culture. Very much modified, particularly in the aftermath of Mao, but, where codes of etiquette and so on have obviously largely disappeared. But it was fascinating actually to be able to make that connection between the two cultures.
Okay, well, that's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And thank you very much, Professor David Abulafia. And I can't recommend your book, The Boundless Sea, enough.
Thank you. You're very welcome. All right, bye. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening. And if you did, please do join me for future episodes. Goodbye for now.